Hey everyone, and welcome to inSUBSTANTIA with me, Gabor Farkas. Today, we're diving into the super interesting ways our brains work, how they shape our learning, our decisions, and how we react to everything around us. Now, this is a really rich and dense conversation, so we decided to break it down into two parts. You're tuning into part one right now. I'm absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Ewa Lombard with me today. She's a brilliant neuroscientist and behavioral economist who studies the deep links between our memory, our emotions, and how we make choices. Her work really helps us understand why we do what we do, looking at how our past, our feelings, and even those biases we don't even know we have influence everything from what we eat for breakfast to those big life-changing moments. In this first part of our conversation, we're going to explore what really drives human intelligence, how our emotions and memories shape the way we think, and what that all means for how we learn, bounce back from challenges, and adapt. I'm really excited about this one, so let's get started. Dr. Lombard, welcome to inSUBSTANTIA. Would you like to take over and introduce yourself a little bit further?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. So my name is Ewa Lombard. I am a senior researcher at the Laboratory for Uncertainty, Collective Intelligence and Decision Making at the University of Geneva. Before that, I was a professor at Montpellier Business School, and before that, I also worked in the industry. I hold a double master's degree in management. So I really try to bridge the two worlds of management, business, and the neuroscience of decision making. And currently, I teach psychology of finance and strategic foresight at the Haute École de Gestion, and I also offer trainings in neuroforesight and in visionary leadership in a collaboration with a boutique consultancy, Gravity et Grandeur.
Thank you. So let's start with an easy one. What defines sustainable decision making, and how does it differ from traditional decision making models?
So it's funny you should say that this is an easy one because we're actually struggling with proposing a really cogent and coherent definition. It seems like a lot of fields have their own definition of what is sustainability. And just to name a few fields that are most prominent here, it's environmental economics, who mostly talks about balancing economic growth with planetary boundaries. There's the environmental sciences or earth sciences that really mention the limits of the planet and the ecosystems on it. And then there's the definition that I would more closely lean to, which comes from environmental psychology, which is about maintaining ecological balance while promoting human well-being. So this is a slightly broader definition that doesn't just talk about ESGs, which is what you would find in finance, for instance, but also about human well-being and sort of the human positioning within the ecosystem of which we're part. So that's the definition of sustainability. Now, what are sustainable decisions, and what's the difference between other economic choices that we study in behavioral economics, for instance? I would say the main difference is in the complexity of these choices. So to me, as a neuroscientist, the easiest way to explain what are sustainable decisions is to compare them to moral dilemmas or moral decisions. The reason is that we very often see activation in similar networks when we pose people a very difficult moral dilemma, such as, for instance, who should die in this very difficult situation where only one person can be saved. And when we ask people to, for instance, make an impact investment choice. It might sound very striking, but the difference is that it is not just about weighing the cost and the subjective value, or as the economists would say, the subjective utility of a certain choice that very often can be expressed in monetary terms, but it's also about some additional consequences of that choice. And in this case, it's consequences for someone else in the future. So for instance, on other people or on people who are not yet born, the future generations, and the environment, which is also, let's say, a separate entity. And so what happens in the brain is that we need to consider these preferences of others, and that activates a part of the parietal cortex, the so-called TPJ, which is part of the theory of mind network, in addition to all the other regions that are typically involved in economic decisions, which is the prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum, so the reward systems.
Neuroscientists have been suggesting that emotions shape decision-making. Can you explain how emotions and stress can influence decision making in high stakes situations.
Right. So most of the time, we would assume that for high-stakes situations, you probably have all the time in the world, so that you can really take your time, use your entire prefrontal cortex, no stress, and come with a creative response that perhaps required a lot of study, some research, or maybe consulting with other people. When stress comes into play, and it's a similar situation to when you are under fear. So let's say you're scared of being judged. This is frequently the case, for instance, at work, right? You're supposed to speak up very quickly, come up with an idea, and there's your boss watching. And this might be a stress-inducing situation. And in that moment, if it's a situation where a lot of cortisol is released, you're under influence of the adrenaline, your amygdala will probably be highly activated. And that very often leads to reliance on habitual responding. So what happens under fear is that sometimes it's referred to as the amygdala hijack of the model-free learning systems in the brain. What I mean by model-free is the ones that allow us to be adaptable, to consider various options, to use our memory, to be creative in the moment to come up with a creative solution. And instead of going that route, you only have access to your striatum, which is where habits are formed. So this habitual responding will be more likely to take over, and rather than being maybe slow but creative, you have to be fast, and so you have to rely on habits that are already there. That's what happens when you are forced to decide and respond very quickly under stress.
In the book Determined, Robert Sapolsky talks about free will and argues that there is no such thing. So without going too deeply into this debate, how does the notion of free will impacts our freedom in our decision making?
That's another really big question. It's very interesting to consider. Let me entertain. So I disagree. I think we do have free will. And you will see that there's, probably as many scholars on one side as on the other. And probably that book by Sapolsky was some kind of provocation, just to have this debate. Yes, it's true that not a lot of processes that our brains or our nervous systems in general carry out are accessible to awareness, and not a lot of them are accessible to this model-free learnings. So the ability to really decide and really shape your decision. We have this fantastic stimulus response learning system, which is what all animals have. And very few animals have access to, let's say, this prefrontal cortex that allows them to pause and plan an action, or to pause and decide, oh, this time I'm not going to respond in the same way. Yet again, I think it takes effort, all the thinking, all the decision making, all the consideration, asking yourself questions. Is this the right choice? Because our parents did that, does that mean that I should as well? I'm afraid that's something that we're meant to be going through in life development, and it's part of growing up to become more critical of your own choices, to gain some form of awareness. But of course, there are limits to it. There are biological limits to how much of the computation that your brain does is accessible, and how much of that you can actually change. Not everything you would like to can be changed, because learning is also costly. It's physically costly. It takes memory, it takes attention, it takes building of new bonds between neurons, new synapses, and so on. And it's also cognitively effortful.
Oh, I see. Well, it's not going to be resolved very soon, whether we do or don't have free will. How do financial incentives impact our ability to think and act sustainably?
I would say in general, they do two things. The first one is they reward the desired behavior, which is why I think it's good to have them. So imagine, for instance, the subsidies for buying an electric car rather than a thermic car, or tax breaks for installing solar panels on your roof. All of these are desirable because they reward the behavior that we desire in society. But at the same time, they also do a second thing, which is what most monetary incentives do. I wrote an article about this many years ago when I looked at how students learn and whether providing monetary incentives at some moment in the process of learning would be a good idea. Turns out it might be in the short term, but not a good idea in the long term, because you create a certain dependency people will expect to be paid or to receive some kind of monetary compensation for doing sustainable things, for making sustainable choices. And in short, it might also crowd out their intrinsic motivation to acting sustainably. So they will not be doing this out of their own free will, if we shall go back to that term, but rather maybe for the money.
How could AI help humans overcome cognitive biases when making long-term economic or environmental choices?
So this is an interesting question that I haven't really delved too deep into. I know that AI is being used very successfully in resource management systems. So wherever you have a scarce resource, you need some kind of decision support system just to analyze the massive amounts of data. And I'm talking here, for instance, about waste management or water delivery in a city or in urban planning context, things like that. There's a lot of potential for using AI to optimize the efficiency with which resources are distributed and managed and maybe recycled. On an individual level, if you mean sustainable choices in life, such as, for instance, consumer choices, I could envision that AI or some kind of private coach, your tutor in decision making, could help you overcome at least two biases that we're prone to make in consumer decisions. One is the availability bias, meaning that we only base our decision on the little information that we have in the moment, not just because of what's available in the store, but also due to the limitations of our own time and mental capacities of how many things we can consider at the same time. So that tutor could make the number of criteria to consider in a certain decision broader. It could also literally help you make the comparison. I very often use this in my own difficult consumer choices, which food processing robot to buy. And then it's very nice to have a nice table that compares all the criteria that you think are most important. And in this case, we could prompt your robot or your AI to emphasize the criteria that are important for sustainability. So this is a way of nudging you to consider these criteria in, let's say, the top 3 criteria that you look at. So it's not just price, but it's also perhaps the number of kilograms of CO2 that were emitted in the process of production of that product, or some other long-term related metrics that products can be compared upon.
Certain traits, such as resistance to change, appear to be hardwired into the human brain and are closely linked to loss aversion, the tendency to fear losses more than we value equivalent gains. How does loss aversion impact economic sustainability? Is it a form of cognitive dissonance? And what explains this phenomenon from a neuroscience perspective?
That's a very complex question because you're building on several biases at the same time. And the first one, from an evolutionary perspective, loss aversion is actually a smart strategy. I mean, we were wired to avoid things that can potentially harm us or that are bad for us, maybe in the long term, and stay away from them was probably more useful for our survival rather than being risk-taking in the gain domain. So this is what we would explain something that was defined by Danny Kahneman as the prospect theory, meaning that we need a lot more, on average 2.5 more risky reward in order to choose the gamble in comparison to the risky potential loss. And loss aversion, I mean, I can only think of several circumstances where it's actually maladaptive and we should strive to avoid that bias or maybe unlearn that bias. And that circumstance is, for instance, making investments in the stock market. I recently heard about an example where they used an attentional manipulation to help the elderly see the gains as bigger. And as a result, this reduced the loss aversion that they had because they always chose the more certain options to invest their money rather than the stock market, which seemed like a very risky, although potentially gainful option. So that's about loss aversion. Now, your second part of the question was about cognitive dissonance and how sustainability plays into that. Cognitive dissonance might definitely appear. It's a phenomenon where essentially you act in a way that conflicts with your values or beliefs. I have a favorite example, which is a cartoon that I sometimes show in my talks about sustainable decision making. It's a cartoon that says animal cruelty is wrong. but also so delicious. And so you can think of, yourself enjoying your beefsteak on a Sunday and still deeply believing that we shouldn't be harming these intelligent animals. And how do you deal with that? Well, most people actually try to adjust their underlying belief rather than to change their behavior. So there are at least three ways that you can deal with it. The first one, perhaps something that would be desirable at a collective level, is to change the behavior, to stop eating meat in that moment, right? If your belief is such that it's wrong, it's morally wrong. Unfortunately, the preferred behavior, and that's also something that has been studied with fMRI, so neuroimaging in neuroscientific experiments, is to actually change the belief and disregard or downplay the information that is coming to you. So the next time, you buy your steak and you still feel a little uncomfortable, you feel the cognitive dissonance of that decision, you tell yourself, oh, at least they had a good life. They were raised in Switzerland. This is not imported beef. I know that the conditions for the life of these animals are proper, and that makes you feel a little bit better with that choice. So you change the belief, you downplay the information that is conflicting with your underlying belief. The third behavior is that you can justify the behavior. So you can rationalize your actions, such as telling yourself, oh, it's Sunday dinner and I have to feed my children some red meat because it's very good for their health. And so unfortunately, the latter two is what we do most of the time. And what we've seen with fMRI, researchers have seen that when you sort of forego this option that would have been aligned with your underlying beliefs, and you choose something that you perhaps prefer, but it creates this cognitive dissonance, your preference for this previously preferred option is reflected in subjective value in the reward system in the brain. And that signal is decreased. So you kind of post hoc change your preference, change the subjective value of that originally preferred option to justify and, sort of be aligned with your current choice. So the current choice, even though originally it was cognitively dissonant, it will become the preferred option in terms of your subjective valuation of it as signaled by the ventral striatum in the brain.
What cognitive skills would you say are essential for long-term thinking, and how can they be developed?
So I think this is a challenge for the current generation and also for the generations to come. These long problems, as we call them, weren't necessarily there for the generation of our parents. And I probably also wasn't taught how to deal with very long problems in my education. So this is something that we need to start training our children for quite early. The cognitive skills that are necessary is, first of all, and this is necessary in absolutely all choices, critical thinking. So the ability to seek out information, evaluate what you see, and really think for yourself, make up your own mind in line with perhaps some criteria that you are very much aware of. But there are other skills that are necessary that, again, perhaps weren't such an issue many years ago or several decades ago for the previous generations when it comes to tackling the problems that we have now, because not only are they far in the future, but they're also very complex. So they required collaboration, they require coordinated action on a very large scale across disciplines, across countries, and across different individual personalities and so on. And so for that, I would envision that we need to train students. Students need to have experience in solving complex problems, approaching them with collaborative creativity, so solving them in teams, or perhaps with the help of technology. Maybe already using some real life challenges and projects where students can train themselves just in the process of thinking and approaching a complex problem, especially those related to sustainability. And with that, they will develop all the social skills that go with it. So that includes the negotiation within a team, considering the values and the criteria for decisions of others, and also the use of AI to support, for instance, the search for information, horizon scanning, going over certain scenarios of the future. So these tools that come with certain techniques of long-term decision making, such as foresight, some of them, I believe, they can be greatly bolstered with AI. But we need to start training early. So this idea of futures literacy, which is a skill of the 21st century, as pronounced by unicive, is something that we need to start teaching in school. So the skill of thinking and projecting yourself far into the future, thinking about the consequences of a certain choice for others and for the future generations, that's something that requires practice. And of course, if it's the first time that you're confronted with such a decision at the age of 50 and you have absolutely no practice, you've never been faced with such, your first response might be, oh, this is a very uncertain territory of, 20 years from now, that's a very far horizon. I'd rather not venture into that decision. Or I don't believe that anything that I will come up with today will be valid 20 years from now, because you don't have the tools that come with foresight and futures literacy.
I suppose that the current generation's behavior is more or less impacted by the reward mechanism in the brain that can trigger addictive behavior in many situations. So with the instantaneity of responses that happen with the mobile apps that we're using to communicate, that has greatly changed the way we relate with other people. How can that be trained to functions differently if you are accustomed to be immediately gratified with an answer and you don't have to wait, you don't have to go and do long research in libraries in order to find answers to the questions you're asking, because they are now even more so with the AI at the tip of your finger through just prompting the system.
So is this a question about the instant reward culture and sort of the fear for the sensitivity of the reward systems of the young generation, or is it about relating to other people?
So I was thinking about what you just said before in your answer, and I thought that those two things might be linked somehow. Because I grew up without mobile phones, you had to write a letter and wait for the answer. You had to go to the library, read a lot of books in order to find answers to the questions you were seeking. And now those don't exist. You don't have to wait for letters to come. You send a message on WhatsApp or email, and if you're not getting an answer within a few minutes or a few hours or maximum a few days, then you are dismissing the person as someone maybe not worth communicating with. So how does that impact your behavior in other contexts, and how can this be trained for projects or perspective that require more time?
Right, I see. So there are two aspects here. I think one is this ability to delay future rewards, which is called delay discounting. And this is indeed part of the 3 cognitive skills that are required for making decisions about the future, so futures thinking. And the second part is about being able to wait for social reward, so building long-lasting and strong relationships with others, which I believe the pace of building that hasn't really changed. And it might be a little confusing to think that we can substitute online relationships with the real relationships that haven't really changed pace. So let's talk about the first one. It is indeed an issue if you are not able to wait for your reward. This is an ability that has been researched already in the 50s, this ability to wait for the second marshmallow. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the experiment that was done mostly in 4-year-old kids, where there were...
I am, yes. And also the follow-up to how that impacted their lives in the future, what impact the test and the outcome of the test had on their future, because the study continued.
Exactly. So the very interesting outcome, actually the main researcher of that, the designer of that experiment said it was not so much to show that kids that cannot wait for the second marshmallow don't end up well in life. His point was to show that this ability, this impulse control, the ability to wait for your reward can be trained, but it should be trained early. And so education should not be aiming only to impart, language and mathematics knowledge. It should also also impart these life and cognitive skills, including intertemporal choice. So being able to extend this time between effort in the moment and the reward that will come later in the future. This hasn't changed. I think life is still designed that way, that people who can wait, who are patient and persistent, are rewarded with long-term positive outcomes, including attaining your education, long-term relationships, and also success in their professional lives. So this hasn't changed. We still need to be able to wait and work patiently. There are two other skills that are involved in the process of futures thinking. So this prospection, what the brain actually does when it thinks about the future and about different plausible scenarios for the future. One is prospective memory, so this ability to project yourself into the future and imagine what will be the possible outcomes of a certain choice, for instance. And that's something that relies on pretty much the same network in the brain as memory. That's why it's called prospective memory. So we have the hippocampus, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and a little bit of the retrospinal cortex involved in these processes. And the third is related to something close to the salience network. It's a skill of being able to simply remember to carry out the action that you planned. So this is executive control, planning, and remembering, yes, at 5 o'clock, I'm supposed to go and pick up my child. So all these three cognitions together enable thinking about the future and making decisions about the future. And I would argue that we use all three almost daily and in almost all the choices, especially the choices that require us to make a decision about a certain experience, not a product, but an experience. And a lot of choices are made very much based on some assumptions and our own imagination of how we believe a certain experience or service will make us feel. So a lot of times we don't have the correct information, or we have very little information. We have to rely on this ability to imagine ourselves and also to learn from others. So observation of how the decisions of others have turned out for them is actually very precious knowledge. It allows us to learn from others something that we don't need to experience ourselves. So in that way, having a large social network and seeing and seeking a lot of social information could be beneficial to social learning, because it shows you all these alternative courses of action without you having to go through the real experience and maybe make the real mistake, right? We also learn from mistakes. So to sum up, I think we still need to learn to collaborate in real teams. So even if it's remote, the people behind it are still real people. They haven't really changed their pace in how long it takes to build a relationship, I would say, even though the communication is now much faster. So that's something that cannot be replaced with instant messaging. Perhaps it can be supplemented with technology because you now have access to many more people than, let's say, 30, 40 years ago. But the process of building a relationship, of building trust, is still a slow one, and it still takes the same amount of effort to wait for somebody to appreciate you, perhaps.
What specific personality traits make people better at future-oriented thinking?
So this has actually been studied, even though this is ongoing research. So it's a fairly recent scale that I like because it builds on a lot of previous research in psychology of time perspective. So this idea of mental time travel has already been studied in the 80s. There is a very famous instrument for measuring how people relate to the past, the present, and the future, which is called the Zimbardo Time Perspective Inventory. And there's a scale that was proposed by Swiss researchers back in 2018. It's Fanny Lalo and her colleagues. They proposed a scale which is called the Future Consciousness Scale. And it builds not only on this future time perspective from Zimbardo's work, but also on 4 additional concepts. The first one is, as I said, seeing the future as a possibility, so a positive attitude towards the future, as opposed to a negative one, which would be fearing the future or being very anxious about what's going to happen. The second is systems perception. So the ability to not just see yourself as an individual that makes choices and that's it, but to see sort of the bigger picture, that there are certain dynamics around you. That's also something that perhaps requires experience, life experience. The third one is called agency. So the belief and the awareness that you have a certain power to act within your locus of control, that you have self-efficacy, and that you can shape your own future and perhaps also the collective future of people around you. And that perhaps might also be related to life experience. The fourth one is openness to alternatives, which is similar to the big five: openness to experience. So having a spirit that is receptive to new ideas, seeking new information, being curious, and so on. And the last fifth element is concern for others. So having some traits that relate to self-transcendence, so preferring sort of being part of a bigger collective purpose or goal rather than just having power for yourself. So self-transcendence rather than self-enhancement in terms of your personal values.
This is actually something we explored with Professor Sandro Catacin in a previous conversation on what are the triggers of civicism. To what extent is this ability shaped by culture? Has research explored how long-term thinking differs in predominantly Buddhist cultures compared to Judeo-Christian ones?
This is a very interesting question, and I must say I haven't looked at the differences between Buddhist and Judeo-Christian traditions. Of course, there is always a cultural component in your tendencies of how you consider the world, how you consider life, how you consider the purpose of you being here. I know of certain indigenous populations that have been studied, and they're often given as examples of this very long-term thinking, especially in collective decisions. These are examples that were studied by anthropologists. For instance, the Iroquois Confederacy, they have a very sophisticated system of governance that incorporates the voices of both past and future generations. They use something that is called the Great Law of Peace, which governs the Confederacy, and it emphasizes the importance of considering the impact of a decision of current community on the next 7 generations. So that's a very long time in the future. And it really exemplifies something that we have lost, this ability to think, okay, it's not just about you and maybe your children. It might be about the impact of this action in a few hundred years from now.
That would be really helpful if we could integrate this way of thinking into the climate change debate and thinking. How does uncertainty impact our ability to think strategically about the future?
Most people are uncertainty avoidant, although there is a lot of individual differences. So I wouldn't say that most people resist uncertainty. Actually, there are certain age groups and gender differences. Little kids have no uncertainty avoidance. I don't know if you've noticed, but they want to explore. And to them, the value of exploration is much, much higher than any potential risk that they don't even consider. So this resistance to change or fear of something that is unknown mostly comes, I think, when you already have a lot and you're afraid to lose it. And I would say that it's not so much a trait of an individual, because I strongly believe that people have some form of self-determination and free will and so on. So at an individual level, we have a lot more free will than we do at a collective level, especially within a system such as an organization. So I wouldn't say that individuals are resistant to uncertainty, it's organizations. And that's something that has been shown in management science research over and over, that we have this managerial short-term, that we have the built-in constraints on certain decisions, and that, of course, if you have to consider, I will have to justify this decision before the board and before this consultant and maybe the future generations of the board, and it might cost me a bonus, then obviously you think 3 times and you probably prefer the conservative option.
Can you tell us about something called the status quo bias?
So it's exactly what I mentioned. It's this fear of change, essentially. It's not so much that we prefer the status quo, it's just that we don't want to change. And this is, I would say, again, not so much a trait of an individual, although some individuals, once they get very comfortable, they might really prefer things the way they are. And then it's a rational choice, actually. So even from an economic perspective, if you have a lot to lose and you have these uncertain changes with uncertain benefits on the horizon as an option, it's a rational choice to try to stick to what you have. I believe that it's the organizations that probably fear and resist change and the unknown more than the individuals, because of all these systemic norms, because of all the heavy infrastructure that will need a lot of time and effort to be reoriented, perhaps in a strategic decision. And that's why so much effort is put into this agile change management, right? We need an entire technology and a method in order to move not just the individuals, but also all the processes that they are a part of.
Research suggests that emotionally compelling storytelling is one of the most powerful tools for shaping beliefs and changing minds, even triggering oxytocin release and fostering trust. What makes storytelling so effective in influencing perception, and what neurological processes occur in the brain when we engage with a compelling narrative?
The reason why we like stories so much is because they are really the preferred mode for us to learn. So the brain, and specifically the memory systems, create episodic memories, and then sometimes they also make the effort to create semantic memories. But episodic memories is essentially what happened to you. So what did you do yesterday? What did you have for breakfast? And maybe this prospective episodic memory of what you plan to do tomorrow. And there's a certain structure to these events. There is a hero in that story. It's you. There are emotions that this hero is going through that you are very much aware of. And there's a causal relationship between the situation and the outcomes and the consequences of the situation. So these are characteristics of the input for the memory system that is most easy to memorize, especially if it contains memorable elements such as emotions and surprise. So we like to hear stories that are cohesive in terms of causality. Our hippocampus loves to see patterns and loves to make analogies and maybe seek and see patterns where there are none. But this is the learning mechanism. So it's simply natural and easy for us to obtain and memorize information that is served that way. And the second element is this ability to identify with the person in the message. So especially when it comes to communicating difficult choices or inviting people to make difficult, complex choices such as are related to sustainability, it's very important to find a way to help them identify themselves with the person in the message. There's a website that actually promotes this kind of storytelling, which is called Potential Energy Coalition. And their message is that it's not just about this hero, the person in the message, that has to be very much relatable, and it's best when it's a testimonial, right? So if you're speaking to moms, you show a mom who tells a story of how she handled her toddler's tantrums, for instance, and that is much more convincing than some kind of conceptual message about, buy this product, it's going to help you handle the tantrums. And the second part of their messaging is tomorrow is too late. So really bringing in this aspect of urgency and the fact that climate change is something that's going to affect us, not just these, people that don't exist yet, the future generations very far ahead in the future with whom it's difficult to identify because maybe you haven't met anybody or you don't plan to have children and so on. Tomorrow is too late suggests that, these changes, unless you act, are going to affect you as well. So this urgency is also a second element that's important in messaging for climate change.
So throughout history, compelling storytelling, connecting or triggering emotions has been used for nefarious ways. I'm thinking about the first one that happened shortly after printing was invented and started more or less in Switzerland is the witch hunt, which was disastrous. But nowadays, storytelling is also being used to promote fake news and made up stories about certain facts and create dissension that has an impact, direct impact on how democracies work. How do you see that this could be curtailed? What elements can we introduce in order to make sure that it doesn't completely destabilize society?
That's a very difficult problem, and it's a recent problem. Well, you say that before that we also had witch hunts, so it just demonstrates that it's a form of natural mechanism to trigger and engineer collective beliefs, and that we are easily convinced. There is a certain dynamic to us. Humans are not designed for detecting accuracy. Humans are designed for living well in a group, and therefore conformity with a certain group belief is actually a good strategy to survive, to be part of the group. So you don't want to be on the dissenting side that says, oh no, the sun does not revolve around Earth. That's heresy, right? So it's hard to bring in facts that contradict the beliefs of the majority. And we know that very well. It's been studied with fMRI that information that affirms the beliefs that you hold, so this confirmation bias, actually triggers a response in your reward system. And this is what will make you seek confirmatory information to your underlying beliefs rather than seek to change these beliefs when you know they are wrong. We also have another bias that acts to our disadvantage, especially when it comes to accepting negative information or information that we don't want to hear, such as, for instance, your probability of you developing cancer in your life or being robbed. It's slower to learn from negative information than it is from positive information when you learn, oh, actually, your risk of developing breast cancer is much lower than you believed. That's something that we assimilate much more readily than information that would be to the negative. So when it comes to solutions to this very difficult problem, I cannot come up with anything better than we have to keep talking about it. We have to teach our kids and students about information literacy. So there's verification of sources. Now we have an additional agent to hunt, which is AI, that very often provides no sources or provides hallucinated information and does not fact check. So this difficulty of verifying what is true and what is not true has always been there. We are not at an advantage when it comes to our brains, and it would take really individual and collective effort in trying to create an informationally literate society.
So, should policymakers use storytelling to engage people in long-term thinking rather than short-term reactive behavior?
It's hard to extrapolate because here the research in economics has mostly been made on two-choice gambles. So it's only a choice between A and B. When it comes to thinking about the future, there could be potentially several plausible scenarios. This is how we frame complex decisions far ahead in the future in foresight. And out of these scenarios, you cannot really put a probability on the outcomes. You can certainly say, oh, this seems like it's more plausible, and also we might have more control over the outcomes in scenario A versus scenario B. But when you introduce this uncertainty to the equation, you lose a lot of the audience, especially if this audience doesn't have the time to engage again in this sort of slow decision-making process. So it's hard to say. I guess your question was about how should policymakers use messaging in order to convince people to support climate policy. Is that what the question was?
Not exactly. It's how they should engage people in long-term thinking rather than short-term reactive behavior.
So as an easy way I can think of is participation in citizen decision-making, which can be done through hackathons. That's something that we do in Geneva. I am an affiliated member and a long-term fan of Open Geneva and of hackathons that we organize most of the time on sustainability-related topics and challenges. So that's one way of giving people some decision-making and creative problem-solving power. It's a complex problem that requires multiple actors and probably a very long time to solve. A second is to run scenario workshops. So teach people foresight, teach people futures literacy. And it's simply an exercise that even if it doesn't supply any meaningful results, we're not going to solve climate change with scenario thinking. It is a very useful mental skill for good long-term decision-making to have. So that's something that I teach in a business school. I believe most business schools nowadays have foresight as a subject, and business students are taught in how to evaluate complexity and how to do horizon scanning and how to look for weak signals of the future in the present, and also how to envision the adaptation of an organization. So what kind of strategic steps could be taken given that we see scenario A versus scenario C becoming more plausible and closer to reality. So I cannot think of other solutions than experience, giving people the experience, giving people the opportunity to engage and involve, even if it's for 24 hours. So these very short-term collaborative innovation sprints are actually very effective in changing people's minds and also in enhancing their intrinsic motivation to contribute and to find meaning in their work. That's also a line of my own research, which hopefully will be published soon.
Wow, that was a lot to unpack, right? Such a dense conversation already. So, we're going to pause things right here for now. But don't worry, we're not done yet. In part 2, we're going to dive even deeper into things like decision-making biases, the power of collective intelligence, how AI is getting involved in our choices, and even really interesting and maybe a little controversial look at how testosterone might play a role in leadership. Make sure you stick around for part 2. It is available or will be available wherever you're listening to this podcast right now.